Good evening. Welcome. Hello to everyone, and welcome to the CBC Saskatchewan special live event for The Pit, one of the best podcasts I've ever experienced. And I'm not just saying that because I'm joining you here tonight. I'm your host, Peter Mills, and tonight we're going to get a chance to meet the hosts of The Pit, and you're also going to get to ask them some of your questions. I'm joining you from Regina, Saskatchewan at the CBC Saskatchewan studios here on Treaty 4 territory and the homeland of the Métis. Now, we'd like to welcome everyone watching around Saskatchewan here in the same province as me, but we know for a fact that there are also listeners of The Pit joining us all across Canada, in the United States, Europe, and even as far as Australia. In fact, one of our hosts will be joining us from Perth, Australia, and you will already know that if you are caught up on the podcast. So thank you, regardless of where you are, who you are, for taking the time to join us tonight. Now, we have a few things to go over. First, an exciting one. We have a giveaway to encourage you to participate in our event tonight. So first, get your phones, get them ready. You'll see a QR code on the screen right now. And so just hold up your phone and open up your your camera app. I'm not a technology guy, but yeah, take a picture of the QR code there and you'll learn how to enter. And it could be, you'll have a chance to win a great CBC Bluetooth speaker. It is absolutely fantastic. So make sure to enter that. Now, if you're scrambling to get your phone or you are unable to scan the QR code now, don't worry. We'll make sure to put it up later in the show to give you a chance to enter to win that CBC Bluetooth speaker again. Now, before we dive further into things, just a few reminders about tonight. Now, you can submit a comment or a question. You can do that at any time by emailing thepit@cbc.ca. Now, as you can appreciate, we need to screen the comments and the questions before we bring them to this program. We're just days away from a murder trial, so we can't be talking about or asking questions that obviously haven't been investigated properly or could do anything to, of course, jeopardize this trial. So keep that in mind as well. But again, you can get those comments and questions in. Don't be scared just because of what I just said. We'd still love to hear them. We're going to be screening them. We'll get as many of them on as possible throughout our program tonight. Again, you can do so by emailing thepit@cbc.ca. And as I mentioned, we'll get to those throughout the program as we can. Okay, that's enough of me setting things up. Are you ready? This is why you showed up tonight. I'm most excited, too, about meeting our hosts of the most recent episodes of The Pit. First up is Alicia Bridges. Alicia is the one joining us from Perth, Australia. And if you are caught up on the episodes, as I mentioned, you'll understand why. It's actually 9 a.m. in Perth right now. So thanks to Alicia for getting up early and joining us while it's evening here. Good morning, Alicia.
Morning, Peter.
So again, people will know if they listened to the most recent episodes, but remind us for people who aren't quite caught up yet, what was it that took you back to Australia?
Well, basically, it was the pandemic. Like everybody, I guess, my situation was pretty drastically affected by that. I am obviously originally from Australia. My family is here. And the pandemic made travel between Australia and overseas very difficult. It still is difficult, actually. There are a lot of people who just can't get back to Australia because there's issues with travel in and out of the country. So in order to be close to family, we had some illness in the family. So had to move back to Australia. It was a difficult decision because I loved my life and my work in Saskatchewan, but ultimately it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, and just with that in mind, Alicia, despite this major move, you're still very committed to this story, to this podcast, to the upcoming trial. And, it's hard enough just being here, let alone 16,000 kilometers away. And I'm just wondering, what was it about Sheree Fertuck's story that really grabbed you at the beginning, and what's keeping you telling this story?
Yeah, I think initially it was the fact that we just didn't know very much about Sheree's story. It appeared from the outside to be a cold case. We hadn't had any updates or any news about progress in the investigation for a long time. And when we spoke to Sheree's mum, Julianne, she, basically she wanted to participate in the interviews because she wanted to keep Sheree's story in the public eye, to keep people thinking about it, in the hope that potentially some new information could arise. I think over time the story it's obviously evolved. It's grown broader and bigger. Obviously, finding out what happened to Sheree is the biggest part, the most important thing about this story. But there are obviously new elements that have come into play since Greg's arrest, such as the Mr. Big sting. So it's now a story about law and the justice system and police conduct. So all of those elements obviously keep us interested as well.
Yeah, and we'll get to a lot of what you just talked about as well throughout the program tonight. I'm also curious, though, too, what's it like to be still covering this story after, multiple years and during a pandemic?
I mean, it's definitely become a big part of my life. It's affected major decisions about where I live and what I do. I think that, it's been, I mean, it's a privilege, really. Sounds cheesy to say, but I think to have been given the opportunity to speak to all of the people that we have, to have been able to get to know Sheree's family as well as we have. We really just have had a lot of support along the way. And also, I'm always sort of surprised by people's willingness to speak to us. So I'm very grateful for that.
Well, Alicia, of course, you wouldn't be able to continue the work necessarily without some help here in Saskatchewan, especially with the upcoming trial. And that's where Kendall Latimer comes in. Now, Kendall is a reporter at CBC Saskatoon, and she joined the Pitt team in episode 8. Kendall isn't able to join us live tonight, but luckily we did catch up with her and Alicia last week. Here's a bit of that conversation. Hello, Alicia.
Hi, Peter.
And hello, Kendall.
Hi.
It's really weird not to have seen either of you for so long, but I understand that obviously you guys have had the same experience, but much further distance. Just when was the last time you guys were even in the same room together?
It was a very long time ago. It's actually hard to remember. Well, Kendall and I actually worked in different cities. So I was in Saskatoon, Kendall was in Regina. So we only really saw each other for training, work events, things like that. So I guess in a sense, we're kind of used to working remotely together. Anything we've done together, stories we've worked on together previously, we always would have done them over the phone or, video calls as well. So, yeah.
Well, Kendall, I mean, you joined the Pitt team after Alicia had moved back to Australia, and I listened to the episodes. We hear a little bit about it, but just tell me, how you two have been making it work from such a distance.
Lots of coffee and caffeine. No, really, it's obviously all been about technology that's been making it work. It's a lot of coordination and communication that is required, making sure that when we set a time, we're talking about the right time zone. Is it Saskatchewan time, or are we talking from Alicia's perspective? So that's really key. When we're chatting together, we have to meet in the early morning or late in the evening, because obviously we both need to sleep. So there's a period in both of our days where it just doesn't work to be chatting over Zoom or through GChat or what have you. So technology has been key for us. It's been really helpful. I can be working away on a script or on some ideas using a Google Doc, and then I can go to bed and leave all of my thoughts and ideas. And then as I'm sleeping, Alicia can jump in and be working away, kind of taking it to the next level. So we've been kind of collaborating through time and space, and it's been really interesting to work around the clock like that, because it's basically a 24-hour cycle of, when I go to bed, Alicia starts working, and when she goes to sleep, then I'll pick it up. So it's a little nonstop, a little different, but so far we've been able to make it work thanks to, all the apps and technology and the internet.
Alicia, I know you both do work 24 hours and put a lot of effort into your work. I'm wondering if there are any positives to this, though, too, because, of course, if you guys were in the same newsroom, you'd be, kind of constantly talking about it here a little bit by little bit. But maybe in this way, you're more committed to really, diving in, focusing it all at one time? Like, have there been any positives to the distance between you guys?
I mean, I guess it extends the length of our workday because Kendall can put in a full day, finish up, and I can sort of pick up where she left off. I mean, I definitely miss being able to speak in real time. And it does, it create delays, I guess, when there is that time difference. So I would say, for the most part, it's a challenge. It's something we have to work around. But it does give us a chance to kind of catch up. If something has been happening in Kendall's day, it means I can react to it right away here, because it's, when she's going to bed, I can get started.
Yeah, because as if you guys weren't working enough already on your own, now together you are working 24 hours a day. Kendall, or actually Alicia, let's dive into episode 8, the trial. Fans of the podcast will know that there's an updated message at the very beginning of that episode. And I remember when I listened to it, even though I was around you guys, I forgot that didn't happen, weeks after you put the episode out. That happened the very next day. So, Alicia, tell me, what were those 24 hours like?
Yeah, so I mean, that episode was obviously to bring us up to the present. So much had changed since our previous episode was released. I had moved back to Australia. Kendall had come on board, so we wanted to introduce her, bring her into the story, because she's going to be working on it so extensively. And so all of those things, we needed to see how the family were feeling before the trial was to begin, and then also get the perspective from Greg's point of view through his lawyer, Morris Bodnar. So the episode was due to come out on the Friday before the Monday that the trial was set to begin. And that's exactly what we did. We had everything ready to go. We felt like at that point, it was safe, I guess, to release it at that point, that the trial was definitely going to happen, because it was a Friday morning, before the weekend. But obviously things change. I went to sleep because it was my bedtime here after the podcast was released. And then, everything changed while I was sleeping.
Wow. And while you were sleeping, Kendall, what do you remember about those 24 or 48 hours?
Yeah, it was a bit nuts. Obviously, we had been very aware of the risks of COVID and how that was impacting day-to-day operations and just routine things that we were expecting. But we had been checking in regularly with the court and with the people involved in the case, and there had been no indication that we should be bracing ourselves for a postponement or some sort of news like this. So we released the episode. We're feeling good about it. And I had been in a meeting on Friday afternoon, and our managing editor very casually broke the news to me. And I remember wondering if I had simply zoned out or something and had imagined what he was saying, because he had said the Fertuck matter has been postponed. And it wasn't really registering for me. I thought perhaps maybe I didn't get enough sleep. We were kind of burning the midnight oil trying to get this episode out so people could catch up before Monday when it was supposed to begin. And then sure enough, I checked my email and there was the directive coming from the court, the explanation from the judge, Justice Richard Daniluk, telling us that, we were postponed. And this matter that we had been gearing up for and preparing to cover had been adjourned for essentially 6 months. And so I was scrambling. I knew Alicia was sleeping. I think I remember messaging her saying that, I hope you're having a really good sleep, because when you wake up, you're going to feel very tired when you get this news. And was also trying to coordinate with our senior producer, Corrine Larson, trying to figure out, what do we do about this episode that we just released that was hinged on this trial starting? And at the same time of trying to figure out all these logistics about the podcast and the storytelling, I was also really thinking about the people that are directly involved in this matter. Of course, lawyers on all sides have been preparing for months. We know that Sheree Fertuck's family was very ready and had been preparing a lot for this day in court. And we also know that Greg's lawyer, Morris Bodnar, was very worried about his health and any sort of delays that could come up. So there was a lot going on that day, trying to get in touch with Alicia, figure out what to do next, and then also considering, these were people's lives and our people's lives that were directly affected about this. So it was a very busy Friday, to say the least.
Yeah, to say the least, indeed. And I know Alicia and I will be talking more about this throughout the event, but obviously you both have had so much more time to think about this case and think about it going forward. And Kendall, before we let you go, I mean, the trial of Greg Fertuck is coming up soon now after so much time. What do you think we can expect to hear and learn on the podcast and CBC News as you're covering it?
Where to start? We will be hearing a lot, and I think that what is key to this case is what exactly happened with the Mr. Big investigation. Of course, we know that police officers were pretending to be criminals to build a relationship with Greg Fertuck to obtain information, to try and solicit a confession, which they did. Of course, we know that Greg Fertuck, after being arrested, previously told the podcast crew that he just made that story up. So what we'll be hearing is the ins and outs of how that police sting unfolded, what happened, what scenarios played out, and how did they get to the point of the confession, and then what led them to that arrest. So we'll be hearing all of those very specific details. We'll be hearing a lot of testimony from police officers about that time period. But we'll also be hearing from character and witnesses, I'm sure. So perhaps people from Sheree's family, people from Greg's family, people that knew them, knew their relationship, and knew the couple. So it'll be very interesting to watch how we hear the ins and outs of how the criminal investigation played out, but also a little bit more about the characters and the people involved in this. And what's really interesting is we'll be able to bring the listeners information that we haven't been able to tell them before. Like there are things that we know through the preliminary hearing, for example, which is basically a mini trial, if you will. And that's when people meet in the courtroom to figure out if this is something that should go to trial. So lawyers will present evidence of what they think can make the case. And so Alicia sat through that and got a lot of information, but because there's a publication ban on matters such as that, we haven't been able to release that information to the audience. So once those things start coming out in the courtroom, we'll be able to bring that directly to the audience. So there's going to be so many details unfolding, Peter, and we'll be covering it, of course, for the podcast. And we'll also have some help on the ground from our CBC News colleague, Dan Zakreski, who will be kind of covering the day-to-day basics of what's happening in court for CBC News, other platforms, radio, TV, and the World Wide Web.
And we'll definitely be following to all of it. Alicia and I will be talking a lot more about many of the things you just touched on, Kendall, but I think as we heard, both of you have put in a lot of hours after hours, and that includes right now for you, Kendall. So thank you for making this work. Thanks for taking the time, and best of luck covering the rest of this.
Thanks, Peter.
Kendall Latimer is a reporter at CBC Saskatoon, and of course also co-host and co-writer for The Pit. Make sure to follow Kendall on Twitter because, as you heard, she'll be providing coverage for both CBC Saskatchewan and The Pit throughout the trial. Before we move on, I wanted to give people a chance once again to enter our contest today. You should see that QR code again right there on your screen. So get your phones out and scan that QR code. Just hold it up to your phone and scan it, and then fill out the details, and you will be entered to win a really great CBC Bluetooth speaker. Again, so just scan that QR code now, fill out the details, and you'll be entered to win. Okay, let's go back to Alicia. So she's here, of course, to take questions from you. You can do so by emailing thepit@cbc.ca. It could be about the logistics of podcasting or any questions you have from previous episodes of The Pit. Again, email thepit@cbc.ca. You can ask anything at all. But again, we'll be screening those comments just because we cannot jeopardize the trial. And of course, we're dealing with a criminal case here. We also have Brian Pfefferle standing by. Brian is a criminal defense lawyer and will also be here to answer some of your questions as well. I know we're going to be talking about Mr. Big Stings. So again, get those questions and comments in now. It'll give us time to go through them and then give them to our guests here later tonight. The Pit at cbc.ca. While you get those emails in, we're going to listen to part of episode 2 of The Pit. And Alicia, can you set it up for us?
Yeah, so this episode is called Echo in the Valley. It is named for a memory or, I guess, a recollection that was shared with us by a neighbor of both Sheree's mum and also someone who lived close to the pit. We also hear from Sheree's mum, Julianne, in this clip, and it's always emotional for us, and I know it was for the family as well, to hear from Julianne. Obviously, she passed away in 2018. So she was a big, she fought for Sheree, basically. She was the voice for Sheree before she passed away. So, yeah, I think we also want to remind people as we go into this that, none of Julianne Sorotsky's suspicions that she raises have been proven in court. Obviously, Greg Fertuck has denied the accusations against him. He says that he is innocent, and he is obviously planning to fight those charges in court as well.
All right, let's listen to this together right now. The segment runs about 10 minutes. And again, this is from The Pit, episode 2, Echo in the Valley.
For days, a group of about 100 people search the area. They hop into trucks and onto four-wheelers, snowmobiles, and even break out their crop duster planes to cover more ground. They look down wells, along freezing sloughs, through grassy areas, and inside abandoned buildings. But nothing turns up. Sheree could be anywhere.
Christmas was coming and the weather was really turning bad and cold and starting to snow and blow, and some the guys were saying it was -30 in some of the places they were searching, and with wind coming up and snowing, it got to the point where it wasn't safe for us to keep people out more than a couple hours.
Hopes of finding Sheree alive begin to fade, and so does the search. It's now December 18th, a little more than 10 days since Sheree was reported missing.
The search for Sheree Fertuck is expected to continue this morning. Julianne joins me now on the line. Good morning.
Good morning.
Sheree's mum, Julianne, makes an appearance on a local CBC radio show, Saskatoon Morning. She's speaking with the host, Alicia.
When she didn't return home, what were your initial thoughts?
Well, when she didn't come home at the regular time that she usually does, I thought, well, she had stopped to visit someone and she would be home at some time that evening. But when she didn't come home all night, wasn't home in the morning, then I thought, well, I better go see if she's out at the pit.
And she wasn't there?
No, she wasn't there.
What do you think has happened to her?
I have no idea, Shad. I think she's been abducted, and for the life of me, I can't figure out for what reason she might have been taken, and I don't know.
Abducted. It's one of the many theories shared by community members. There were optimistic thoughts too. Maybe Sheree left on a last-minute trip. Maybe she forgot to call home. But Julianne always had a feeling something terrible happened to her daughter. And she wouldn't hold back when people asked. When Victoria and I went to see her in March of 2018, she told us there was one person in particular she had suspicions about. Sheree's husband, Greg Fertuck. Sheree had previously voiced her concerns about him to Julianne, or at least alluded to them.
I can't remember if she'd ever say Greg for sure or not, but I think maybe sometimes she did and maybe sometimes she didn't, but I just assumed that that's who she was afraid of. Yeah. There was different incidents when she'd say, Mom, if anything happens to me, do this or do that. So she kind of always had it in the back of her mind. I think that she was very uneasy about Greg's disposition.
Julianne says Sheree told her everything. They talked a lot. Sheree worked at the gravel pit close by, so she would pop by Julianne's farm at least twice a day. There, Julianne got a glimpse into Sheree's home life in Saskatoon, and things weren't always good.
I mean, Sheree was a big girl. She could fend for herself. But, there were different instances when she ran out of the house because, he was either abusive with her verbally or physically.
Julianne says she confronted Greg once because of what Sheree told her, and she says his answer was clear.
I never, ever did that. I wouldn't do that to her. I loved her.
Greg's mum and brother will later tell us the same thing, that Greg was very much in love with Sheree. Sheree and Greg were married in 1991, and they lived in Saskatoon for decades. They raised 3 children together, but as the years passed, their relationship began to sour. By 2010, Greg has moved out, and their separation soon evolved into talks of a divorce. Nothing was ever finalised before Sheree disappeared, but Greg and Sheree still worked out at the pit together. He would help his estranged wife when she needed an extra hand.
Oh, well, when Sheree went missing, that day I phoned him and I said, "Have you talked to Sheree today?" "Nope. I haven't talked to her. I was waiting for her to phone me and let me know if I had to come and haul gravel again."
Over time, the image of Sheree's missing persons photo starts to fade in people's memories. People outside Sheree's family start to move on with their lives. The community stops searching. By April of 2016, the weather finally lets up, and the RCMP make an announcement.
Julianne Sorotsky doesn't know what happened to her daughter, but she now knows it's not good. Earlier this morning, RCMP said publicly they now believe that Sheree Fertuck is dead and the victim of a homicide. Sorotsky struggled to fight back tears at a news conference.
Her number one priority was her children and her one and only grandchild. And we miss her so much.
RCMP are stepping up the search for her body with the weather turning. They'll be checking specific locations around the province. The spots came from tips during the investigation.
This is news to the public. She was a person of habit and predictable behaviours. Police say for her to up and leave in the middle of a workday, that was suspicious. After lengthy searches, analysis of evidence, and their overall investigation to date, police not only think Sheree is dead, they think someone killed her. But who would have wanted to see her die?
It's definitely a very mysterious case because, a lot of the evidence is circumstantial and, you can presume this or presume that, but that doesn't fly in court.
4 months into the investigation, and no word on suspects. If the police know anything about who might have wanted to hurt Sheree, they're keeping it under wraps. Fast forward to June of 2019, and we're on our way back to the pit. So we're just following the 2 RCMP officers down into the gravel pit. The last time we were here, there was snow on the ground. Today, it's a bit different. Although the wind is still howling, it's warm out, and the sky looks angry as it threatens to rain. There's a man and a woman waiting for us at the bottom of the pit. The man is clean cut, he has salt and pepper hair and a strong jawline. He's wearing a polo shirt tucked into dress pants. The woman beside him is dressed in a floral top and a pink cardigan, her hair pinned into a loose bun. The only thing that gives them away as police officers is the badge and gun clipped to their belts.
I'm Ron.
Hi, Ron.
Hi.
Hi. Pascal. Pascal, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
Victoria.
Hi, Pascal.
Nice to meet you.
You too.
All right.
So this is kind of the area. Obviously it changes. The landscapes have changed a lot in 3 years simply because of the...
Yeah.
I mean, it's a gravel pit, so it's a constant movement going on here, so...
That's Corporal Pascal Loriot and Constable Ron de Goya. They were part of the RCMP's initial investigation of Sheree's disappearance. Pascal says it's been more than 3 years since she's been back to the pit.
Totally looks different, but similar to what it was at that time. Just the piles are in different spots and the hole is different.
She wasn't there for the first couple of days of the search. It was initially in the hands of the local detachment.
So when the detachment first got here, they didn't know what they had. So they dug, for example, if the scenery was like this, they dug in some of the gravel because they figured that maybe she was buried accidentally. So they were searching right away, so possibly destroying some of the evidence that later we found out we may have needed. But then it became apparent that it wasn't accidental and she wasn't found in the immediate area where they were digging and searching.
It made sense. Simply at the time,
they thought maybe
because you look, these piles are probably in places 20, 25 feet high, and I mean, when they're digging, you can get a shear edge, and if for some reason Sheree had got out and got close to the pile for something and it had collapsed on her, so I mean, at the outset there was there was fresh digging, and so it made sense for them to go up and do the digging. So we're not faulting anybody for doing that. That would have been probably the first avenue to say, hey, if she's buried under here, we got to try to find her. So because there was nothing else to point to anything else that had happened. So,
by looking through the gravel, just trying to do the thing that seemed to that made sense at the time, not knowing what you know now. But I mean, how much of a difference do you think it made to the evidence that could have been present if there was any evidence there?
I don't think it would have made a big difference. Evidence doesn't show very easily on gravel, so I don't think that it would have made a huge difference had they not touched anything. And I mean, eventually we would have had to dig in there to see if she was there regardless, but I don't think it would have made a big difference.
Well, that is an excerpt from The Pit, episode 2, Echo in the Valley. Now, let's bring the host you heard there, Alicia Bridges, back into the conversation. Alicia, what happened in subsequent searches of the pit?
Yeah, well, I mean, the pit was searched initially, obviously, multiple times. I think even in the years following, it was searched sort of every summer or multiple summers. But when Greg Fertuck was arrested, that search expanded outside of the pit into farmland areas around the pit, but not sort of in the immediate place. So sort of not long after Greg Fertuck was arrested, we received a phone call from a farmer in the area who had seen a convoy of police heading out to an area sort of close to the pit. We drove out there. I think it's kind of interesting to note that area, everything just, to me, from the outside, as someone who didn't grow up there and didn't live there, it all looks very similar. They're grid blocks. They're all the same size. They're all sort of like, in summer, they're green fields. Everyone has a little, it seems to have like a pool of water in it. There's a little pocket of trees, but there's really no like distinguishing marks. So we needed to have these like very specific instructions, even just to find it. So when we arrived, the officers there were searching. They had been searching actually for multiple days before we met them there. And at that point, I think we're quite disheartened because they hadn't found anything. And ultimately, they didn't find Sheree's body as they had hoped to. We also know that police searched an area, as Greg told us. He took them to bushland. Obviously, he had told the police in a confession that he now says was made up because he was afraid. But he had told them that he had killed Sheree at the time and taken her body to a location. So he led the undercover police there. And again, now he says that wasn't true.
Alicia, before we move on, one of the questions one of the things that really captivated me about this podcast is that it's right in our own backyard for all the people joining us here in Saskatchewan, right? It's an area I've personally driven by countless amounts of times. I'm curious, you talked a little bit, we got to see the area, you talked a little bit of what it was like, but I'm curious, how do the people involved in this case feel about it? Did you hear from anybody else just how they feel about that pit in the area now?
I know we spoke to the police officers about it. They said a similar thing, that every time they drive past Kenniston, they think of Sheree. Kendall actually recently went and met Tika at the pit, and I think it's obviously. I mean, even for us, it's an isolated place. So when you drive in there, you can see the highway from there, but it doesn't feel like anyone can see you really. It's quiet. It's usually windy. So, I mean, the place itself, when it's not a hive of activity being used as a gravel pit, is a little bit of an eerie place for anyone who doesn't sort of usually spend their time out in the middle of nowhere, really. And I think for the family members, it's not as emotional, I don't think. They don't go there. It's not a place that the family would go to hold like a memorial or anything like that. That's something that you obviously have to hear from them about. And I think Tika does talk a little bit about it, Sheree's sister Tika, in one of our episodes. But the pit itself, I don't think is other than it being the place where really everything changed. And Sheree disappeared, I don't think it's a sort of significant place for the family.
All right. This seems like the perfect time to bring in Brian Pfefferle. Brian is a criminal defense lawyer in Saskatoon. If you've listened to all the episodes of the podcast, you'll know that he has multiple appearances in the pit. And if you have any questions for Brian or Alicia, again, now is your time to get them in. Email thepit@cbc.ca. Brian, thank you very much for taking the time tonight.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So let's start with Greg Fertuck's arrest and the use of a Mr. Big Sting. We've been talking a lot about that already, and this is going to be a big part of the trial. You talked about it. We've heard about it a bit in the most recent episodes. What are you watching for in that regard of the trial?
Well, obviously, this is a very interesting case with so many different components to it. It's hard to say I'm watching just one thing, but one of the things that I will certainly be interested in is seeing, obviously, how that confession evidence correlates or is verified by the forensic evidence that the police found. That is always the key to these cases, in my view. If we go through the history of Mr. Big cases, they're all somewhat similar, but one of the real significant similarities in the convictions or in the acquittals is how much the confession is corroborated by other evidence. And so that's really what I'm focused on. Obviously, I'm interested in other aspects too. I want to hear what Mr. Fertuck would have to say. I want to see what the defense evidence may be, if any. And of course, I'm interested to see if the evidence is even going to be admitted, because at the start of the trial, you'll likely hear that the Crown has the burden to prove that this statement should be admissible. And if it's not admissible, one would be interested to find out what other evidence they would have. The fact that there's no body, obviously, here, also very interesting. But there's too many things to name here that make this case such a unique, almost made-for-TV type case, if I could say it that way.
Can you tell us a little bit just about the precedent or history with Mr. Big Stings?
Yeah, Mr. Big Stings actually started in Canada, and it's a very unique investigative technique which is focused on a specific target. Oftentimes, these cases are kind of Hail Mary type cases where a case will often go cold, almost always involving major crimes like murders or other significant cases. There will be a suspect or a target, but clearly not enough evidence to lay a charge against that target. And what will happen is the police will pose as undercover operatives. They will infiltrate the accused person's life, oftentimes knowing many details about potential vulnerabilities about the person, and then attempt to elicit ultimately a confession from that individual. The reason why we're at trial in Mr. Big cases is always because they've elicited some sort of confession from the accused, which they believe is an admission. And so that's the history here has started in Canada, and it continues. The interesting thing about Mr. Biggs for me as a lawyer and just as a citizen is there's been so much public notoriety behind Mr. Big Stings, and they're all so similar that it just amazes me that year after year this technique continues to be used, and it continues to be used successfully, if I could put it that way, in the sense that it appears that evidence is elicited. The Hart decision from the Supreme Court of Canada that came out a few years ago changed the law in many ways. And so from a legal perspective, it flipped it on its head. Instead of being presumptively admissible, like most confessions are, Mr. Big cases now make the confession presumptively inadmissible. So the Crown needs to prove it's reliable and trustworthy, and it was done in an appropriate way. Very interesting police technique. I've been involved in a few cases personally using the technique. We see some really interesting police work and really interesting fact scenarios. As I say, truly these cases are made for TV.
Well, Brian, you touched on a lot of what Cole and Carly in Saskatoon asked, but I just want to ask the question since they were one of the first to get questions in. They're curious, what do you think will be the critical factors in the case? Like you touched on a few, they said, one, if Mr. Big stings or if it's going to be admissible or inadmissible. Two, the fact that the body or no body was found. Three, Greg's alibi. Are there any other critical factors that you can talk about?
Well, I'm interested always in these cases to see if there's any real significant mundane details that the accused gave that would give that credibility or reliability to the statement. The other thing I'm interested in is hearing the vulnerabilities. And this is one of those very strange cases, thanks to the work of the podcast here, by being able to interview the accused. That in my experience, I've never seen anything like it. The interview that was done here, it was unusual, but also created heightened interest for me. There's going to be some interesting vulnerabilities, I think, that are alleged here by the accused based on the interview that that was conducted here by the podcast. And I'm interested to see how those vulnerabilities may have played into any confession evidence, if it makes the confession less reliable. And the million-dollar question always in these cases is, does the confession line up with the evidence? And the listener there poses a couple of different questions. And the fact that there's a missing body, it'd be very interesting to see what forensic evidence is available. And if there isn't forensic evidence, how can we believe that the statement from the accused here is reliable if there's no other forensic evidence that links it? Lots of interesting things, though, no doubt, and I'll be interested to see how the evidence develops.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Brian. And let's bring Alicia Bridges back in. Alicia, what are you and Kendall going to be watching in those first days of the trial?
Yeah, I think, again, the Mr. Big Sting for me is, I mean, of course, the case obviously rests on whether or not that evidence is admissible in the first place. And we expect to hear in the first few days what that evidence will be. So I think that the ins and outs of the Mr. Big Sting, how that was carried out, the way that the police became involved in Greg Fertuck's life. We also have the element of Greg Fertuck's memory loss. That's something that he told us about in the interview that we did with him. He says that there are parts of what happened that he doesn't remember. And he told us that incident where he was injured and suffered memory loss happened during the Mr. Big Sting, and that the police had the undercover police, who he believed were his friends and believed were a part of this criminal organization. He told us that those police had come back to him after the memory loss. So sort of the individual, we know about how Mr. Big Stings work through previous cases, but I think the way that this one in particular was carried out with sort of external factors of what was happening in Greg Fertuck's life at the time, I think will be really interesting.
Brian, to bring you back in, this is obviously something the most recent episode of The Pit addresses, but Greg Fertuck's been in jail for more than 2 years now. Does that factor into the court case, into this trial at all?
No question it does. It has an influence on a number of things. Obviously, in Canada, the presumption of innocence is such an important presumption. When an accused person hasn't had a verdict, that's so significant. We also have someone here who is missing, presumed deceased, a family, loved ones that want to see this come to an end and see closure. And we have police resources that have been used over many months that need to come to see the fruition, I guess, of the police work. But in terms of the impact it has on the case, witness memory is always the significant one when time and memory fades. As time goes on, we expect that memories don't get better. And it will be very interesting, particularly when it comes to civilian evidence, if there's going to be evidence like alibis or whereabouts of individuals, or character type evidence that's being given that would speak to the relationship of these parties. As time fades, the facts no doubt fade as well. And if there's going to be inconsistencies and those sorts of things, it can factor into the case, and it can weaken a Crown's case more often than strengthen it.
I want to go back to our listener questions. Again, you see the on the screen there. If you have any, get them in quickly. Email thepit@cbc.ca. Alicia, this is a question from Eric. Eric says, I was wondering how challenging it is writing the podcast for a global audience. I think it's great that people from around the world are listening, but does that make it hard for you to write for your listeners that maybe aren't familiar what life is like in rural Saskatchewan?
I think from the outset, we tried to create this podcast with a global audience in mind. We know that podcasts of this nature often travel that way. They don't just stay local, that people that, because those stories resonate everywhere, stories of, stories like Sheree's story. So we tried to make sure that we really communicated a sense of place as well, of what Saskatchewan is like. I think the characters helped to do that, the people that we spoke to, the sense of what Kenaston was like, this feeling of rural Saskatchewan, a feeling of, the cold, and how the weather and the actual physical environment really affected the investigation. And the capacity of the people who were looking for Sheree to search for her early on. Over time, I think, we've tried to do things like make sure that we explain things such as obviously the Mr. Big Sting is something that we would explain anyway, but it's something that doesn't exist in every country. So I think that it's interesting to Canadians because it's something that applies within their justice system nationally, but also for people in other countries, that's a concept that they may have an opinion on whether or not that's something that should be allowed here, should be allowed there. So I don't know. I just think they're universal themes, the things that we're talking about in the podcast. So I don't think it's changed our writing a lot, but we did always consider that from the outset that we were writing for an audience outside of Saskatchewan.
Well, and Alicia, this is something that I'm personally thinking about throughout listening to this podcast. Typically when you kind of dive into a podcast, you recognize that there was a lot of work that went in before they produced it, they released it, and that's kind of the end. You might get a follow-up, but for you guys, it really has been that, and then now it's continuing to unfold. The trial is coming up. Just how has that been, and how is that going to affect the storytelling going forward?
Yeah, well, I mean, as I sort of mentioned earlier, it really has, the events it's all happening in real time. So we don't know what's going to happen next. We obviously have to react as things change. I think we're very ready for anything to sort of, for the unexpected to happen, because it has all the way through. Like, every time we thought that we, had a sense of what was going to happen next, just even in terms of the trial, that it's delayed by 6 months. I mean, obviously the pandemic has been a huge factor in what's happened, for everybody involved. So I think we expect the unexpected with this story. I don't think that's going to change, but I guess, we'll find out more when the trial begins.
Well, with that in mind, Brian, I want to bring you up before we wrap it up. With the trial beginning, just any more thoughts that we haven't touched on yet?
I have to say that people in Saskatchewan and across the country should be tuning into this case, because I think we're going to see some of the best of our justice system. It's a very exciting case from a legal perspective. I think that what we're going to see is Mr. Big on trial, and we're also going to see confession evidence on trial. And I'm very interested to hear about how the evidence is corroborated, and I'm also interested to see these players describe what's occurred. The other thing that I'm interested to see, and I mean, frankly, this podcast is very unique, as I say, in the sense that oftentimes victims of crime will have a voice prior to trial, but the accused, because of the right to silence and the don't speak kind of general rules that we operate under, we have a lengthy statement given by the accused to this podcast. Is that going to play a role in this trial at all? And I mean, Alicia, and when she started this podcast, I'm sure wasn't planning on being part of the trial and part of the evidence. But I'm interested to see how that might unfold. I really am. Like, there's just so many variables here, and I don't know any more than what the general knows about this case. So I'm eager to see how this plays out. And I'm also happy to see closure come for all the parties. I've represented accused persons before that are innocent of their crime, that the crime that they're being suggested have been committed. And it's incredibly frustrating and stressful for their families. And of course, victims as well here that are waiting for this first day and the days that follow. So it is, I think everybody's ready to see this case unfold in this province particularly, and people closely involved in it.
Well, that seems like a great way to wrap it up. Brian, thank you so much for taking the time. And Alicia, I think I can speak for everybody who's tuned in. Thank you for bringing this story. Thank you for continuing to work on it. We look forward to hearing more and experiencing more as it unfolds.
Thank you, Peter.
Brian Pfefferle is a criminal defense lawyer in Saskatoon. And of course, Alicia Bridges is the co-host of The Pit, and she joined us from Perth, Australia. And also, of course, thanks to The Pit co-host Kendall Latimer, who, as you heard, will be covering the trial throughout the next few weeks. Last but not least, of course, we want to thank you, the Pit listeners, and everybody who joined our special live event tonight. I know I can speak for all of us when I say I really appreciate your interest in this and your support of the Pit and podcasting in Saskatchewan. It's really a unique way to bring us around stories like this that you might only hear in the headlines otherwise. So again, don't forget to go subscribe and follow the Pits wherever you get your podcasts, on Apple Podcasts or the CBC Listen app. You'll be getting, if you do subscribe and get the notifications, you will be, of course, the first to know when new episodes come out. Make sure to check out cbc.ca/sask, because, of course, we'll be having coverage there. And then you can go to the website cbc.ca/the Pit for the latest coverage. Now, before we move on to our thank yous for the rest of the night, as for our giveaway, we will be sharing a post-event YouTube link, and we will announce the winner of the Bluetooth speaker early next week. So stay tuned for that. And again, thank you, and who got your questions in to enter for that draw. And a lot of other great people to thank for tonight's broadcast. Justin Dealey is the man behind the software coordinating it all. So great that we were able to do this. My man, Dan Plaster, is behind the camera with me here in studio. And many thanks to our incredible communications team here in Saskatchewan, Taryn Cochran and Jane Tran. The senior producer of The Pit is Corrine Larson, also did a great job coordinating all this, and she did a lot of work on the podcast as well as things evolved. And as you hear at the end of every episode as well, editorial guidance from David Hutton and Paul Dornstadter. Again, I want to thank everybody for listening to the podcast, for joining us tonight. I'm Peter Mills. Stay safe, stay healthy, and be good to each other.